Hello everyone, I'm Professor Plink. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. If you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. And of course, like the video, maybe pop in a comment. All that stuff goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, that beautiful, intelligent pinnacle of technological perfection, and keeping my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video. When I was going through my process of deconversion, it was an emotionally taxing time that took far longer to come out the other side of than I would have originally expected, as any journey through religious deconversion is liable to be. But one of the things that helped me through it was to hear other people's story of losing their faith. It let me know that I wasn't alone, and more specifically, that others were having many of the exact same thoughts and feelings that I was. It can be particularly rough when you have a cultivated religious community around you that you yourself have cultivated when you were still a fervent believer. Now you feel you have no one you can talk to about what you're experiencing, no one to connect with who will understand what you're going through. And it was very comforting to hear the deconversion stories of others here on this medium of YouTube. So I thought I might do things a little differently today and go through the story of my personal journey out of religion. I have touched on it from time to time in my normal counter-apologetics videos, but I've never fully expressed what I experienced in its entirety. So that's what I want to do here today. I was born into a Roman Catholic family and raised in that faith all through my childhood. We attended church every Sunday, rain or shine, blizzard or blistering heat. I went to Sunday school after church all the way through 18 years old. I was an active participant in my church, an altar boy when I was younger, and an instructor/class leader when I was a teenager for the younger kids' summer Bible school program. I never doubted the existence of God, or that the God that existed was the God that I had spent years hearing about in all of my religious activities. I was what I would categorize as a typical Catholic. Most modern Catholics have adopted the undeniable realities of this world that were resisted by the Church in previous centuries. We believed in heliocentrism, round Earth, old Earth, and evolution, though God-directed. Now, the Catholic Church was and is a downright criminal organization of abuse and sweeping illegal and unconscionable activity under the rug. But your average Catholic tends to at least accept modern science. And that was me. But despite not being totally whacked out religious fundamentalists, there were and still are a lot of backwards beliefs that Catholics hold. And I was no exception. Believing homosexuality is a sin, anyone who doesn't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior is going to burn in hell for all eternity, divorce not being allowed, so if you don't get an annulment and then get into other relationships, you're committing adultery. And some of my favorite bangers from Catholic dogma, that there are no degrees of sin. All sin is equal in the eyes of God. So taking the Lord's name in vain is just as bad as, say, murdering your neighbor. Oh, and of course, thinking about a sin is just as bad as actually committing the sin. So merely thinking about taking the Lord's name in vain, but not actually doing it, is just as bad as the aforementioned murder. Yes, I believed all of those things. I was a rather typical Catholic, from the time I was born until I accepted that I had become an atheist, which happened when I was 35. But there was a long road to get there. So the first real step in my journey out of religion was a simple one that also ended up being the longest step by far. And it was me losing interest in regular participation in my religion. This started when I turned 18 and moved away to college, though not in accordance with the normal anti-college narrative that apologists like to throw around. It wasn't that I went to college and had professors who told me that God was dead and I was a fool if I believed in him.
And jump to the conclusion, which every sophomore is already aware of, there is no God. All that I require from each of you is that you fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words: God is dead.
The entire time I was in college, literally everyone I met either said nothing at all about religion or was openly Christian. In fact, there was a Catholic church on my campus, and it was the only church that was located on school property. And I did occasionally attend services there and went to events or festivities that were held there. No, there was nothing about college that disincentivized or discouraged believing in God. It's just, I was so freaking busy. I was a full-time student with a part-time job, trying to get used to being out on my own for the first time, and also develop a social life and make friends while I was living in the dormitories. Add to that the fact that I've never been what you would call a morning person, and it just ended up in me wanting to sleep in on Sundays. Church was really early, I was tired, and I didn't want to go. It didn't go any further than that. Not going once turned into twice, and that turned into several weeks, several months. Before you know it, I hadn't been to church, with the exception of Christmas and Easter, in years. And when I was no longer ensconcing myself in Christian platitudes, when I wasn't soaking my brain in a consistent message of what would Jesus do, I basically lost interest in it. To be clear, I never stopped believing in God, never stopped believing in Catholicism, never developed any kind of aversion or dislike for my faith. I just stopped thinking about it very often. I think this was an important first step because it basically lowered my religious defenses. When your church teachings and theistic beliefs are at the forefront of your brain all the time, then anything that threatens or challenges that way of thinking just instantly puts you on the defensive. It's like if someone talks shit about Magic the Gathering and you play that shit every day, well, them's fighting words. But if they talk smack about the game and you haven't played it in years, it's more like, whatever. When you're still fully involved in a religion, well, it basically becomes the sunk cost fallacy, reasoning that further investment is warranted on the fact that the resources already invested will be lost otherwise, not taking into consideration the overall losses involved in further investment. Basically, you've committed so much to your religion for so long, you can't handle anything that suggests you might be wrong for doing so. Well, if you haven't invested much in it for a long time, it's not as hard to consider that it might be wrong. Now, don't get it twisted, this does not mean that I slipped out of theistic belief in any way. No, sir, I basically just existed as a non-practicing, but still very firmly believing in God limbo for the next 12 years. When I turned 30, I realized something unsettling about myself. That I had maintained all the same viewpoints, perspectives, and opinions that I had had since I was a teenager. Everything I thought about politics, sociocultural issues, morality, ethics, law and order. The concept, not the TV show. All of it had been stagnant for over a decade. Now, that concerned me because it meant that I wasn't growing as a person. I certainly did not have such a high opinion of myself that I thought I knew everything there was to know and had formulated the perfect positions on all things by the time I hit 18. So then, it was probably true that at least some of the things I believed I was only holding on to out of stubbornness, out of an unwillingness to admit that I may have been wrong about things in the past. So I decided that it would be a good idea to do a complete mental inventory of my opinions on just about everything of critical importance. So all of those aforementioned things, politics, economics, culture, international matters, war, science, laws, all of it. I'd focus on a particular issue, I'd set aside what I already thought about it, do a little research to find out about different perspectives on the issue, run all of the arguments and opinions about that issue through some logic filters in my mind to see if those arguments held water, and then dispassionately come to a reasonable conclusion about what to think on the issue in question. Now, this resulted in a number of opinions I had changing. For instance, I became fully pro-choice on the issue of abortion. I became completely against the death penalty, as well as becoming a proponent of prison reform, and lots of other issues as well. Now, I hadn't even thought about putting my religious beliefs through this process. As I said earlier, I had never questioned the existence of God. As far as I was concerned, it was a foregone conclusion. But I couldn't think of a reason to not put my thoughts on religion through this mental inventory. After all, in for a penny, in for a pound. If you're going to do it, Plink, do it right. Do it fully.
Do it doucement. Do it very slowly.
So I put my Catholic faith, not my belief in God, through this same process of close scrutiny to see if I had good reason to maintain it. I started doing something that I had never really done before. I started looking into what my religion may have gotten wrong. Now, sure, I already accepted evolution and the age of the earth, which counters the biblical account vis-a-vis the Garden of Eden, but I had long thought that the story of the Garden of Eden was more of a metaphor than something that literally happened. But there was tons of stuff from the Bible that I had either accepted as true or didn't actually know about at all because I'd never actually read the entirety of the Bible. As many atheists will attest, there are few things that will turn you to atheism quicker than actually reading the Bible.
And I think that anyone who is thinking about maybe being an atheist, if you read the Bible or the Quran or the Torah cover to cover, I believe you will emerge from that as an atheist.
I was shocked to discover things like that Jesus was not actually born on December 25th in the year 0 CE. But in fact, he was actually born between 6 BCE and 4 BCE, because it was clearly stated that King Herod was the king when Jesus was born, and Herod died at 4 BCE. And as far as December 25th, that was chosen because early Christians believed that Jesus was conceived and crucified on the same day, 30 some odd years apart, on March 25th. And December 25th is exactly 9 months after they believed he was conceived, so bingo, birth on December 25th. And that was just one thing among scores of other things that my faith had been wrong about. Noah's flood, Moses parting the Red Sea, the supposed witnesses of the resurrected Jesus, biblical cosmology, etc. I mean, I don't want to turn this video into an in-depth exploration of all the stuff that Christianity gets really, really provably wrong, because we'd be here all day. But suffice it to say, I became very disillusioned with my faith when I found out so much of it was pure BS. If it was wrong about all of that, shouldn't that cast at least some level of doubt about practically everything else it claims? So once I could no longer accept anything my Catholicism had told me automatically, I had to rethink all of my religious-based standpoints. Some I had already abandoned. As I mentioned earlier, I'd already come down as pro-choice, and that certainly doesn't sit well with Christianity. And by the same token, I became fully pro-LGBTQ, sex-positive rather than believing in a prudish insistence on no sex before marriage, stopped believing in, well, basically most of the 10 Commandments. I mean, I didn't care about taking the Lord's name in vain, having other gods before the Christian one, keeping holy the Sabbath, making graven images. I didn't really see coveting as a problem. After all, I coveted my buddy's Xbox until I got my own. And honoring your father and mother should be directly proportional to how much honor they actually deserve.
I should have been a better father to you, Dewey. I wish I spent more time playing catch with you and less time training my body and mind to kill you in a machete fight.
I just became very dissatisfied with the things my religion was telling me to think and feel. I could no longer set my morality by what Catholicism was telling me. And the biggest one, the one that had always been a nagging little needle digging into the back of my brain for decades, was the idea that anyone who wasn't a part of the faith I was born into was doomed to burn in hell forever and ever. That had always been something that didn't sit right with me. And the only way I could reconcile that unambiguous proclamation of the Catholic faith with my personal conception of right and wrong was the same tried and true method of all Christians. I simply put it out of my mind and refused to think about it too closely. Because if I ever really considered the idea that my non-Christian friends and family, yes, I have Jewish family members, as well as non-theistic family, that they were all going to go to hell for not being Christian, if I really thought about it, I might never stop crying. And the idea that they would be cast into perdition for what amounted to a basic difference of opinion was a thought that, even at my most pious, I couldn't tolerate. And once I took those blinders off and started to really allow myself to think about all the ways Catholicism was untenable to me, well, there was no way I could ever go back to thinking all of these horrible things that they were trying to make me think. This one's pretty straightforward. When I started letting myself think and recognize the flaws in the faith itself, I also stopped turning a blind eye to those practitioners of the faith who were absolutely reprehensible. Obviously, the Catholic Church's history with CSA and letting its offenders get away with it and escape prosecution, as well as an even longer and more blatant history of violent abuse, as Catholicism is a proponent of corporal punishment. But also the various horrible people of other Christian denominations, like the Westboro Baptist Church, and the New Independent Fundamentalist Baptists, plus the Southern Baptist Convention, come to think of it. Damn, what the hell is wrong with Baptists? Anyway, not that this stage of disgust had any real impact on actually losing my faith, but it did take a bit of the sting out of it. I mean, it's a bit easier to sever your ties with a particular community when you come to realize that so many people in that community are pieces of shit.
They are quite simply the most intolerable herd of steaming social animals I've ever had the misfortune of turning my nose up to. I spurn you as I would spurn a rabid dog.
Once I had gone through all of these steps, once I had fully explored my reasons for having believed in Catholicism for as long as I had, and had kicked around all the specifics of my faith, I really had no recourse. I had to admit that I no longer believed in my religion. I no longer wanted to be a Catholic, nor believed in the church, the clergy, or the faith itself. I was deconverted. And that was a very distressing time, because being a believer had been a foundational part of my identity for the entirety of my life up to that point. I mean, if I wasn't a Catholic, what was I? Who was I? Even though I hadn't been a practicing religious adherent in several years, it was still a part of me. And I worried that losing it would be like losing an arm, or losing an eye, or worse, like losing a loved one. But that worry fairly quickly subsided, because in all honesty, I didn't lose any part of me that I wanted to keep. I kept my conscience and morality, if perhaps a more refined version of it, having dumped the Christianity-imposed tenets of it. I still had my personality, my humor, my love and compassion and empathy. The only thing I lost in the deconversion were the anxiety and fear I had over the thought of an unjust afterlife that tormented good people for the horrid offense of not being the right religion, as well as the cognitive dissonance of feeling the need to comport with, or at least hold as righteous, rules that at a deeper level I knew were wrong. And best of all, I lost the back of my mind depression that my religion was saddling me with that I didn't even realize I was under the yoke of. I'd never even realized how sad being a Catholic was making me all the days of my life until I wasn't one anymore. And my entire day-to-day mood just elevated almost overnight. So yes, I had deconverted. I was no longer a Catholic, no longer a Christian. And yet, I was not yet an atheist. I may have decided to ditch my specific religion, but that wasn't necessarily a reason to abandon belief in God entirely. I mean, there were plenty of people who had lost their confidence in their churches or denominations, but still believed in some greater power, some ethereal, supernatural being, a spiritual existence, an afterlife, a prime mover, souls, magic, divinity, all of it. You'd hear people say it all the time.
You ever hear girls say that? I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I like to reply, I'm not honest, but you're really interesting.
So, though I was no longer willing to call myself a Christian, I wasn't ready to accept the idea of no God existing. So, irrespective of what religion people wanted to practice, I began a more academic approach to reasons to believe in the existence of a God or gods. I still wanted to believe. I was a little desperate to hold on to what vestiges of my faith that I could, even if it were just some non-specific belief in a higher power. So I told myself that all I needed to find was one single valid and sound reason that, more likely than not, pointed to the existence of a God. So thus began what became a 5-year search for a single good reason to believe in God. And this led me, inevitably, into the orbit of what eventually became the object of my scorn, the religious apologists. I started by reading and listening to religious pontificators of all kinds giving the reasons for their faith. But it was pretty much all stuff that I'd been hearing my entire life. Every Sunday I had heard sermon after sermon that were more or less the same. It was people who were good talkers, giving you the bright and shiny highlights of their faith. When you let a salesman talk about whatever they want, they're only going to talk about the positives. The car dealer will only tell you about the features, never the flaws, even if the car they're trying to sell you is a complete lemon. So it became clear quite quickly that listening to the apologist's monologue was never going to get me to the hard questions that any branch of theism needs to address. Things like the problem of evil, God of the gaps, failed prophecies, proven inaccurate creation accounts. Or how about the basic lack of evidence that can hold up to even the lightest of scrutiny? I wasn't getting any of that, so I switched tactics. Instead of listening to the apologist's speeches or writings, I started seeking out debates between believers and non-believers, because this would force the apologist to respond to some of the tougher challenges than they would otherwise prefer to avoid. And when I would watch debates, I would only focus on the religious debater. I would tend to fast forward past the atheist, because I didn't want to hear what they had to say. I still had the negative reaction to the very idea of atheism that had been ingrained in me my whole life. I was still thinking of atheists as mean, spiteful people who just wanted to drag people like me away from salvation into the muck of non-belief with them. So I didn't want to hear from them. I mean, after all, I was attempting to find good reasons to believe in God, and I certainly wasn't going to get that from an atheist. So I just watched what the apologists had to say. Remember, I still wanted to believe, so I was on the religious speaker's side. I wanted to agree with them. I just needed one good argument in favor of God's existence that held up to the same kind of logical scrutiny that I had put my own Catholic faith through. And time and again, argument after argument, none of it ever did. This is the time when I came into contact with all of the greatest hits of religious apologetics. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, arguments from objective morality, argument from consciousness, argument from truth, from beauty, from desire, presuppositionalism, argument from revelation, from supernatural occurrences, from prophecy, Pascal's wager, religion's utility as proof of its soundness. All of these and many, many more. And every time I encountered each argument, I found myself pausing the playback in order to argue to the screen exactly why that argument was flawed. Eventually, I started to wonder what the atheist debaters would say in response to these arguments for God. So I started actually watching some of them, only to find that they were echoing back the exact same refutations that I myself had come up with against the religious arguments. I was finding that these dirty, evil atheists that I'd been so primed to dislike were in total agreement with my line of thinking. The more I read and watched and absorbed of both apologists and atheist rhetoric, the more and more I found that I aligned with the general positions of the non-believers. And the more I found the apologist arguments to be fallacious, ridiculous, and many times, how shall we put it?
Batshit crazy!
So, after 5 years of fairly consistent exposure to the various arguments for the existence of God, I came to the conclusion that there simply were no good reasons to believe. And I realized that I didn't need to become an atheist because I realized that I already was one. It had happened gradually. Throughout the course of my attempt to save my theism, I'd lost it entirely. I no longer believed in God, and truthfully, I hadn't in a long time. All that was left was to admit to myself and let go of that last lingering vestige of my faith. So I admitted finally that I was an atheist. Since that time, I've remained open to the possibility that I may be wrong. I keep looking into apologist arguments. I keep myself open to the idea that maybe some version of God does exist. But every day, with every new attempt I come across to argue for the existence of one, I become a bit more convinced that there isn't. After a certain point, the need to push back against the apologetic nonsense just grew too large. I wasn't just pausing their videos to argue with the screen anymore. I got to the point where I was yelling at the screen about how wrong they were and exactly why their arguments were just so terrible. So eventually, I thought, well, they're putting their thoughts and arguments out into the world. Why can't I do the same? After all, the best way to keep people from being taken in by bad ideas and flawed reasoning is to push back against it, to show just how flawed that reasoning is and exactly why its ideas are bad. So that led me to the creation of my channel. That's why I seek to respond to theological and ideological questions and claims, to give the opposite viewpoint and balance the conversation, to let others who are having the same thoughts know that they aren't the only ones thinking them. Because the more we can normalize non-belief, the more easily people will be able to find their way out of the religious indoctrination that they were subjected to. So, that's my story. That's how I lost my faith. And you know what? That's a bad way of putting it, lost your faith. After all, losing is seen as being inherently bad. You lost your dog. You lost your money. You lost your job. You only put it that way when the thing you no longer have was something of value that should normally want to be kept. I mean, you wouldn't say a person in remission lost their cancer. So, different terms now. I didn't lose my faith. I didn't lose my religion. I abandoned it. I ditched it. I fired it, terminated it, kicked it to the curb. I realized I'm better off without it. So I hope you found my story either helpful, validating if you've experienced something similar, or at the very least, a bit of an entertaining addition to your day. But with all that being said, I think that's where we'll close things off for the day. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Till next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.